ladies and gentlemen. First of all, thank you, Madam, for that kind introduction, and it's a great pleasure to talk to you. I should begin maybe by saying, Madam Chairman, distinguished guests, and fellow scribblers, because we are, of course, that. It's a great pleasure and a privilege to be invited to address this important conference at a momentous time for both the cause of free speech and for religion, in particular for Christianity in its various expressions. In addressing a conference of Christian journalists, therefore, I want to begin by stating very firmly that as both Christians and journalists, we are and should be serving the same ideal, namely that of truth. For Christians, God is truth, just as he is love. For journalists, discovering and presenting the truth of whatever story we have been assigned to that day is our daily pedestrian duty. If we reveal corruption or lies committed by those in positions of leadership in Christian organizations, as in the sexual abuse scandal within the church, we are serving God as well as performing our duty as journalists. And we are doing the same when we reveal the corruptions and lies of the enemies of Christianity. In both cases, we are and should be partisans for truth. And when you add the word Christian to journalist, what you should get is a vocation for truth. And sadly, there are also martyrs for truth. According to the International Federation of Journalists, at the end of 1918, 94 journalists and media workers died in targeted killings, bomb attacks, and crossfire incidents that year. 6 of the victims were women. That was an increase on the number of deaths in 2017, which was 82. I begin with that simple point about truth because, as usually happens in times of philosophical uncertainty and political passion, as now, there's a tendency for people to find the truth to be a very complicated concept. They want to distinguish between the known facts of a particular event, a shooting, say, or a factory closure, or the discovery of a mass grave, and a higher truth of what that particular event supposedly signifies. It is sometimes the case that the higher truth then turns out to be a way of denying or smoothing over or relativizing the small, simple truth of what happened yesterday. But even when the higher truth is neither a distraction nor a deception, it is a premature consideration. Higher truths are the compilations of many lesser truths, and it is our primary job to discover those lesser truths and lay them before the public. We may then demonstrate that there is a larger, compelling truth linking our earlier discoveries in a pattern to which society must now attend. But members of the public have the same ability to draw that kind of conclusion, and besides, we may have been mistaken when we earlier thought we saw a higher truth through the muddle of events. We must always be open to the possibility that our investigations will disprove our initial theory. A highly topical example comes to us from the United States. For much of the last 3 years, American journalists have been reporting stories rooted in the strong suspicion that President Trump was a Russian asset involved in collusion with the Kremlin. Whatever other sins Mr. Trump may have on his conscience, and I don't think I want to speculate on things like that, he seems to be innocent of that particular accusation. Yet millions of readers will go to their graves believing him to be a Russian spy, and countless hours of journalist time will have been wasted. That's why it's vital for us to preserve and follow the rules that journalism in Western Europe and the United States have developed since World War II to ensure the primacy of truth and accuracy in reporting and of fairness in opinion or feature journalism. Some of those rules are well known. For instance, the 2 independent sources needed for a contested story. These are essentially common sense guidelines to protect reporters from errors, including their own enthusiasm for a story. But I want to discuss for a moment the meaning of 3 words. They are objectivity, impartiality, and neutrality. All of them have a place in the journalist rule book, but all of them have come under criticism from writers who believe these words protect the guilty rather than saving the innocent. That is alleged in particular of neutrality. On the other hand, it is also argued that objectivity seeing a situation with clear eyes and a mind free of any distorting influence, including one's own unself-conscious prejudices. It's argued that objectivity is impossible for a fallible human being, and that is, of course, correct. But the fact that we cannot attain complete objectivity, which is possible only for God, does not mean that we should abandon any attempt to do so and treat our partisan prejudices as the higher truth mentioned above. That way lies the subjection of truth to unconstrained prejudice, to fake news, you might say, and also to fake media criticism. We should want to be as honest as we can, including admitting where our knowledge ends and our speculations begin. We should, I suggest, see the three words in the following way. Neutrality is where we begin the search for a story. Knowing a little about it, we don't take sides. What we do is search for the main facts and question both sides about them, and also question as many independent witnesses as we can find in the available time. But we very rarely end a story on a neutral note. Objectivity is where we aim in our investigation of the story and how we conduct that investigation. We may feel indignation if our story is one involving injustice, but we should not allow that indignation to distort our perceptions, even if it fuels our energy. And impartiality is where we should end up. Having looked at all the evidence without fear or favor, having given all sides the chance to comment on our discoveries, we are then entitled to reach a verdict on who did what, when, and how. Once we are sure of our facts in the most mundane sense of that term, we are perfectly entitled to broadcast them. There is nothing weak or temporizing about impartiality. It is a safeguard of truth and an assurance for the reader. I should add a small codicil here about the principle of neutrality in a different context. The modern liberal state often employs what it calls a principle of neutrality when treating differences and conflicts between religious explanations and claims and the claims and explanations of secular science and philosophy. Even in theory, there is a hidden bias in the state's reasoning because it treats belief in a creator God as a matter of faith and belief in the universe as accident as a scientific conclusion. In fact, both explanations of the ultimate origin of life and the world in all its complex beauty require a final leap of faith. Christianity is quite explicit about that. Secularists, however, arrive at their leap of faith by default. They treat the absence of conclusive proof for God as the conclusive proof of the universe as accident. As Richard Legutko points out in his book on liberal democracy, moreover, the application of the principle of neutrality to political clashes, especially on education and parental rights, is usually done in bad faith. All too often, the modern state is not natural in relation to religion. It employs neutral language to obscure an anti-religious bias. We shall see a few examples in a moment. Bearing these principles in mind, I want to look at three current questions involving Christianity and religion. The persecution of believers, especially Christians, the impact of progressive social policy domestically, and the growing influence of international law. Christianity is still the largest faith in a world of thriving religions, but almost all the growth in Christian numbers occurs in sub-Saharan Africa. Asian Christianity does little more than hold its own with other religions, and in Europe, the Christian decline is absolute as well as relative. European Christians are falling as a percentage of all Europeans, in part because they have a lower birth rate than other groups, in part because many simply leave their religion. Between 2015 and next year, the number of Christians in Europe will fall by 8.2 million. Two effects follow. Europeans will have less weight in world Christianity, declining from 24 to 14% of believers of Christians between now and 2060. And Christians will have less weight in politics and the social life of Europe. Because in addition to demography, Christians worldwide face two increasing dangers: religious persecution and lack of powerful friends. They are not, of course, the only believers who face persecution. The murder of Jews in France, the attempted genocide of Yazidis in Iraq and Syria, the repression of Zoroastrians, among others, in Iran, the recent mass murder of Muslims in New Zealand. These and other examples show that religious persecution is rampant and widespread and largely unashamed throughout the world. But Christians come under particular attack from three directions. First, in Muslim-majority countries in the Middle East, North Africa, Iran, Pakistan, and Turkey, Christians, along with Jews, are the victims of a rising tide of Islamist and jihadist fervor. The end result is that some of the oldest Christian communities in the world are being driven from the Middle East, from Iraq and Syria, and that the Copts in Egypt, 5% of the population, live a half-life in the shadows between official protection, Islamist violence, and emigration. The second source of anti-Christian persecution remains militantly atheist governments suspicious of all social activity not directly under their control. North Korea is the most extravagant and horrifying example of such oppression. But China, which has exploited the internet to create the world's first panopticon state, is the most subtle, persistent, and effective persecuting government. When necessary, it imprisons religions wholesale, as with the Muslims, the Uyghur Muslims. Where possible, as apparently with the Vatican, it regulates religions into compliance. Finally, there are states where the government assists its own client religion to keep out rivals by legal regulation, and Putin's alliance with Russian Orthodoxy is an embarrassing example for Christians here. In the face of persecution, almost all religions, however, can turn to protectors. Muslims, in particular, have a strong advocate in the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which unites 57 Muslim states to negotiate their rights in non-Muslim states. Christians in non-Christian states used to enjoy similar or greater protection from Western governments during the imperial period. Today, however, persecuted Christian communities outside Europe can expect relatively little help from Europe, and more surprisingly, little sanctuary either. An astoundingly small percentage of Syrian refugees granted asylum in Europe are Christian. Until recently, it was 0.2%. And when it is occasionally suggested, as it was by then Prime Minister Tony Abbott in Australia, that a special category should be created for Middle Eastern Christians, this was opposed as discriminatory and ran into the sands of bureaucracy. That is a classic example of an abstract principle of non-discrimination being employed so as to ensure, or at least not to correct, an actual practice of discrimination harming real people. Many reasons explain this relative unconcern. Western military and economic power, which once protected overseas Christians directly or through diplomacy, is no longer so impressive. That may be exaggerated, but for the moment it matters. Our human rights charters and laws are simply ignored when convenient by non- or anti-Western states. Even if that were not so, Western European governments no longer have a particular sense of the responsibility they once had for Christians abroad, because they no longer think of their countries as being Christian in any serious sense, including culturally. America and Hungary were, until recently, exceptions to this liberal policy of cautious indifference. America, because of the strong involvement in its political life of religious communities with ethnic links to the persecuted. Its International Religious Freedom Act has given the US a specific responsibility to promote religious liberty throughout the world. It succeeded in getting Vietnam to abandon a policy of forced renunciation of religion. And at the very least, its regular reports keep up the pressure on governments to live up to their commitments to religious liberty. Hungary, too, has pioneered a policy of giving generous and active help to enable Christian communities in the Middle East to rebuild both their churches and their lives in more secure conditions. It sees this as one aspect of Hungary's wider responsibilities as a nation which wants to invigorate as well as protect its distinctively Christian culture. Both both the European Union and individual countries like the United Kingdom have in the last year or so begun to take much greater interest and much stronger action to correct these persecutions. But as yet, these are straws in the wind rather than a harvest of hope. We will need to do a great deal more to counter such levels of persecution and, in the West, of indifference. And only a much bigger investment by the West's own media is likely to generate sustained pressure by Western governments to ensure that improvement. Now let me turn to secular progressivism at home. It's often said that we live in a post-Christian society in all of the countries of Europe and the United States. That is true, but its meaning is generally misunderstood. A post-Christian society is not merely a society in which agnosticism or atheism are the prevailing fundamental belief, at least in public. It is a society rooted in the history, culture, and practices of Christianity, but in which the religious beliefs of Christianity have either been rejected or, worse, forgotten. And there are consequences to forgetting truths. One consequence is that while we instinctively want to preserve the morals and manners of the Christian tradition, we cannot quite explain or defend them intellectually. So we find ourselves seeking more contemporary, in practice more secular, reasons for preserving them, or when they decay completely, we invent regulations to mimic them. When courtesy is abandoned, we invent speech codes which are blunter in their impact and which repress legitimate disagreement along with insults. When female sexual modesty and male sexual restraint are discredited as puritanical, we draw up contractual arrangements to ensure that any sexual contact is voluntary on both sides. This ensures that sexual relationships and their consequences may occur more often, but that they do so in an atmosphere of mutual suspicion and legal wariness that poisons relations between men and women over the long run. Above all, when we no longer protect and strengthen the family on the grounds that it is a patriarchal institution harmful to the life chances of women, we encourage the family breakdown that leaves women worse off financially, pushes men into irresponsibility, and damages their children socially and psychologically. Family breakdown is in fact the largest single social disaster plaguing the post-Christian society. The family is a natural way of regulating and disciplining us and our ambitions in the activities of everyday life. It makes us frugal. It encourages saving, wealth creation, and the deferment of gratification. It compels us to provide for the future. Above all, it ensures that children are brought up and taught to become self-reliant, and that the weak, the sick, and the elderly have others to succor them. When the family breaks down, we get crime, drug taking, impoverishment, psychological problems, and much else at the personal level. And we get a cycle of deprivation, the growth of an underclass, spiraling social welfare costs, over-government, and severe budgetary problems at a national level. The result of family breakdown is that we have to replace the family with regulation after regulation. Our remedies, easier divorce, better financial arrangements for women after divorce, increased welfare for single mothers, bureaucratic agencies to compel male child payments, laws and regulations that disadvantage natural family relationships in court decisions on childcare and adoption, and much else. They never work as well as the stable families they have to replace. Indeed, they sometimes make things worse. Let me give you an example of just a few years ago, which illustrates this. A pregnant Italian woman on a visit to Britain failed to take her regular medicine for bipolar disorder and suffered a panic attack. The police were summoned and transferred her to a psychiatric hospital. She was then sectioned, that is, legally detained in the hospital against her will, but allegedly for her own good. At the suggestion of social workers, a court then ordered that she be compelled to have a cesarean operation, and since she was arguably unfit to care for the child, that her baby should be taken into care and put up for adoption. That was done. The woman in question had a mother in Italy who cares for her two earlier children, and a sister and ex-husband in America, both of whom are on very good terms with her. At no point did the court or the social workers attempt to contact these relatives, nor was any contact made with the Italian embassy about the detention of and forcible medical assault on one of its citizens. The judge, at a later court hearing, where the woman, now on her medicine, was seeking the return of her baby, remarked that she was articulate and competent, but he still decided that her baby should be adopted because the social workers thought that would be in the best interests of the child. No one now argues or argued that the woman was criminal or incompetent or otherwise a danger to her baby. So one has to draw the conclusion that British law and practice now permit agents of the state to force women to give birth prematurely, to seize their babies, and to give them to total strangers, more or less at will, if they arbitrarily decide that the baby would be better off with these strangers rather than with its parents, or in this case, ultimately, with its mother and grandmother. What makes this case alarming is that the judge, the social workers, the police, and the doctors almost certainly believed at every point that they were acting entirely rightly. They cannot see how arrogant, unnatural, and cruel their actions appear to anyone who has not swallowed the idea of the kerning bureaucracy that the state makes a better parent than actual biological parents. The law assumes in many countries today that the social worker is the person who best knows what is best for the child. And the social worker, in turn, believes that his or her decisions are inspired by a professional care for the child that is the equal or even superior to parental love. The most effective squelching of that belief was heard in Congress in America a few years ago, when a Health and Human Services official told Senator Phil Gramm of Texas that he loved the senator's children as much as the senator did. "Oh, really?" replied Gramm. "What are their names?" In short, the best-intentioned regulators cannot replace the family in its most important function of providing sources of order suffused by love. Regulation is always a hit-and-miss matter. The best regulation implemented by the most humane and sensible regulators can never match the love of parents who have known a child since the maternity ward. That said, the most effective regulation will be the kind that supports and strengthens families rather than attempting to replace them. And whatever its purpose, regulation is most likely to work sensitively when it is shaped by the moral values of the local community and when its efficacy can be assessed by local people. But none of these things will matter a hill of beans if curious journalists, in this case on the London Sunday Telegraph, are not around to notice something wrong is being done, to report it, and then, maybe inadvertently, to arouse the traditional moral instincts of the ordinary citizen, and therefore, at one remove, these instincts of Parliament. Until recently, and now my final point, international progressivism. Until recently, it has been national governments that have imposed most of the moral, welfare, and policies that run counter to the post-Christian traditions of their societies. That has changed since the end of the Cold War and the development of transnational and global institutions and law, which naturally seek to impose similar policies on different societies rooted in a new interpretation of human rights and international law. In recent years, these bodies, UN agencies, the European Court of Human Rights, have expanded their powers in three ways. They have promoted and pushed through treaties on subjects from maritime law to the rights of children that give them a basis for intervening in domestic politics. They have secured legal expression of those treaties through judicial activism, internationally and nationally. And they have established monitoring bodies to ensure that signatory countries fulfill treaty provisions. In Europe, the debate on moral issues at the transnational level is further tilted in an anti-traditional direction by emerging European values to which national policies are expected to conform. My favorite example is the warning by the European Commission that a Turkish law penalizing adultery, if passed, will be an obstacle to Turkey's eventual EU entry. We cold-blooded Anglo-Saxon Eurosceptics had long suspected that adultery was a European value, but it was interesting to see it officially confirmed by the European Commission. But this goes beyond a joke. The problem with the laws and regulations handed down in this way is that being remote and maybe undemocratic in origin and reflective of social philosophies that many citizens reject, they are often ill-suited to the needs of local society. They need to be openly debated at the level where they will also be implemented. Whatever we may think of such matters as children's rights, the regulation of political speech, or the prohibition of blasphemy, they are plainly the stuff of domestic political debate. Such debate would expose weaknesses in what initially looked like reasonable reforms. Carelessly granting abstract rights, for example, to allow children to make and maintain friendships against their parents' wishes, is dangerous at any time, but it is positively reckless in the age of internet pedophilia. It would hardly survive either parliamentary debate or tabloid vigilance, if that were permitted. And that goes for other topics of European and transnational moral regulation. Judged politically, these treaties and organizations usually represent the outlook of cosmopolitan liberals rather than those of either religious Americans or even non-religious European conservatives. At present, for instance, progressive MPs in the European Parliament have long been seeking to establish abortion as a human right and to remove any conscientious right to performing an abortion from Christian doctors and nurses. This is illiberal and it's barbaric. It is an attempt to coerce consciences of a kind that was abandoned in 19th century Europe. And it is also very foolish. Swedish sexual morality cannot be imposed on Catholic Poland any more than Catholic mass attendance can be expected in downtown Stockholm. But a great deal of harm and social strife can be created as such policies gradually but inexorably fail. And that's happening today in Europe as a result of transnational judicial decisions, and even in America as a result of federal judicial decisions, and in both countries as a result of the strong and aggressive secularist movement hostile to the traditional moral ethos of even post-Christian society. To end, what is to be done? Well, I have no panaceas to offer. For the present, let me lay out three simple ideas that might appeal to Christians and to traditionalists and also to journalists. The first is the Catholic social concept of subsidiarity, or the idea that, as far as practical, authority should be located at the institutional level closest to the people. This idea is also found in some Protestant denominations and indeed in Adam Smith. So it comes wreathed in different kinds of authority. Its consistent application would solve many of the problems just outlined. We need now in Europe to give it more than lip service. Second, Christians need to rediscover their skepticism of the world's principalities and powers. These include bodies such as the UN and NGOs quite as much as nation states. Post-Christian liberals have invested the emotions they would once have devoted to God and religion in such bodies, which they see as world-saving institutions. Some Christians, not excluding the occasional church spokesman, have incautiously lent support to this mild heresy. But by their fruits ye shall know them, and their fruits include some very questionable social policies. They should be above neither criticism nor reform. Finally, Christians should be wary of lending support to policies that, however seemingly benevolent, reduce democratic accountability in the political process. Democracy is not a panacea, but it ensures that the final judges of a government or policy are those most affected by what it does and did. Because the voters are closer than international civil servants to all kinds of reality, they are more likely to know the practical value of virtuous habits and traditional institutions. Christians were once very slow to abandon the authoritarian temptation in the past, but they should not be tempted by its secular progressive cousin today. Fellow Christians, fellow scribblers, I hope I've given you something to write about before the next conference. Thank you.